destabilize Iran under the pretext of human rights or political freedom. National sovereignty, civilian security, and the right to lawful civic expression are non-negotiable principles and fundamental pillars of human rights, and no pretext can legitimize foreign interference or acts of violence. I thank you.
The next speaker is the representative of Iranian Human Rights Documentation Center.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. On January 8 and 9, 2026, millions of Iranians took to the streets to voice their demand for freedom and a government that respects their basic rights. They were met with gunfire. Thousands have been killed. Many more have been blinded or sustained other grave injuries. Thousands have also been detained and are being subjected to torture as we speak. The full scope of what has happened will not be known for months. A little over 3 years ago, this council held a special session to address the Iranian government's grave human rights abuses committed in the course of the Woman Life Freedom protests. Despite the creation of the independent international fact-finding mission on Iran, the human rights situation in the country has significantly deteriorated. Given the internet shutdown that the Iranian government has imposed on the country, the international community must take swift action to stop further atrocities under this information blackout. The Iran Human Rights Documentation Center joins the call for the renewal of the mandate of the FFMI and urges that the mission is provided the resources it needs to carry out its duties. We also call on the international community to exert diplomatic pressure on the Iranian government to immediately halt the gross human rights abuses taking place in the country. The Iranian people have suffered tremendously. The international community must act now. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra. Thank you very much. I now pass the floor to the Institute for Protection of Women's Rights.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Monsieur le Vice-Président, l'Institut pour la protection.
Vice President, the Institute for Women's Rights would like to call the Council's attention to the terrible events which are taking place in Iran, through which the fundamental rights of citizens have been gravely violated by terrorist acts. In January 2026, protests by certain professional bodies begun by legitimate financial and economic claims have been derailed and deliberately distorted into violent events which have been sown through by terrorist groups. There have been hybrid campaigns, both digital and on the ground, in order to derail these. There have been firefighters, banks, mosques, and private property owners that have been caught up in this. Members, distinguished delegates, as a representative of Iranian civil society, we would like to respectfully call on member states to found their positions on reliable, impartial and credible sources, and to clearly distinguish between peaceful protests and terrorist acts, and to condemn all forms of extremist violence which are being carried out against the lives and property of Iranian people by terrorists and mercenaries. We would like to ask for the explicit condemnation of all interference in the domestic affairs of Iran and all threats against the rights of the Iranian people to self-determination. Thank you. Thank you. We will now hear another video from the coordination of Association des Particuliers pour la Liberté de Conscience.
We are deeply concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran, particularly regarding religious freedom and the persecution of religious minorities. Following recent demonstrations, Iran has unleashed violent repression. Witnesses report over 12,000 deaths, with telecommunication blocked to silence testimony. Victims include teenagers shot in the street and hospitals overwhelmed with casualties. Religious minorities face systematic persecution. The Ministry of Intelligence arrested over 50 Christians on fabricated espionage charges. 8 Baha'i women received nearly 39-year imprisonment merely for promoting their faith. 35 Jewish citizens were arrested for alleged ties to Israel based solely on decades-old travel or social media activity. The coordinated crackdown constitutes crimes against humanity under international law. We urge the Council to establish accountability mechanisms and take concrete action. We remain committed to supporting these persecuted communities. I thank you.
Escucharemos ahora.
We will now hear from Yemek Ehyekaren Tebsonati Vasalamati Iranian on video, please.
President, we stand firmly in defense of the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. At the same time, we reject any attempt to erase the line between legitimate civil discourse and foreign instigated violence and terror. As confirmed by high-ranking officials from the United States and Israel, recent events were deliberately manipulated to transform peaceful protest into armed insurgency. After failing to defeat Iranian nation through external aggression, these actors shifted to a strategy of internal destabilization. Separatist groups supported by foreign intelligence used military weapons to kill civilians and police without distinction. These terrorists deliberately burned public and private property, seeking to undermine national morale and spread chaos. Foreign interference and the support of external media outlets have never served the interests of the Iranian people. On the contrary, such actions only heighten tensions, generate widespread anxiety, and undermine the psychological well-being of society. We urge the Council to end its double standards. How can the defenders be judged, while those who planned, armed, and enabled this violence remain ignored? We urge the Council to conduct a comprehensive investigation, including into the responsibility of foreign states that arm and finance terrorists in violation of the fundamental human rights of the Iranian people. I thank you.
We will now hear another video from Paimavaran Hamyari.
Dear President, Excellencies, I speak on behalf of Chatra to condemn the organized violence that resulted in the deprivation of the Iranian people's right to peaceful protest. Legitimate civic demands arising from economic pressures caused by unilateral sanctions and the reactivation of the snapback mechanism were distorted by the entry of organized terrorist groups, transforming civic space into an environment of insecurity and human loss. In this context, alongside the loss of human life, the right to peaceful assembly, protected under both domestic and international law, was seriously undermined, while violence, incitement, and terrorist acts are never protected under human rights law. We condemn the loss of life among ordinary civilians and among those responsible for maintaining public safety as a result of terrorist violence, and emphasize that human rights are indivisible and that the right to life applies to all. In closing, international and civil society institutions are expected in their assessments to maintain a clear and principled distinction between legitimate peaceful protest and organized violence. Human rights are not strengthened through reports that lack sufficient evidentiary basis or meaningful connection to social realities, and the protection of human rights require avoiding their instrumentalizations. I thank you.
Escucharemos ahora otro vídeo.
We will now hear another video from Article 19, the International Centre Against Censorship.
As this council meets for a special session, the people of Iran remain in darkness under a near-total communications blackout, deliberately imposed by the regime to conceal a massacre of its own people. Article 19 urges the international community to take urgent measures to ensure accountability for repeated crimes under international law. We deplore the lethal repression of this new wave of protests, with tens of thousands of people killed or imprisoned by the authorities simply for protesting. We are horrified by reports of security forces raiding overwhelmed hospitals, beating patients, their families and medical personnel, while attempting to arrest the injured protesters and seize bodies of those killed. The regime's policy of mass detention has been facilitated by broadcasting coerced statements from detained protesters on social media. We express our full support for the fact-finding mission on Iran to carry out an urgent inquiry into these international crimes, to collect and preserve evidence for use in legal proceedings, and call for all resources necessary to be allocated to the mandate to carry out its investigations. We urge states to put urgent diplomatic pressure on the Iranian authorities to stop the bloodshed and restore access to the internet. In light of the systemic impunity, we urge states to initiate investigations under the principle of universal jurisdiction to hold those responsible to account. Finally, we call on all states and private companies that use satellite internet connections to use all avenues to find a permanent and sustainable solution to help maintain connectivity. This includes strict export bans on military-grade jamming technology to Iran to break the regime's communications blackout. Thank you.
Okay, so now we will hear from the representative of Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Mr. Vice President, Civicus and volunteer activists expressed grave concern over the rapidly deteriorating human rights situation in Iran following the brutal repression of nationwide protests that began in late December. Iranian authorities responded with an extreme and violent crackdown on peaceful demonstrations that quickly expanded into calls for political reform. Furthermore, security forces reportedly used overwhelming and lethal force against protesters, including military-grade weapons. Reliable accounts describe wounded individuals executed in the streets and cities placed under de facto martial law amid unprecedented wave of arbitrary arrests and mass unlawful killings. Sources report over 3,000 deaths according to the authorities alone and over 24,000 arrests, whilst a nationwide internet and telecommunications blackout in breach of international human rights law further obstructs life-saving information, documentation and accountability. Senior officials openly threaten protesters with maximum punishment and no legal leniency, signaling further risk of torture, enforced disappearances and grossly unfair trials. We are particularly concerned that detainees are at grave risk of arbitrary executions. We urge this Council to strengthen monitoring of Iran, ensure the renewal and adequate resourcing of the Special Rapporteur and the FFM to carry out an urgent inquiry and support criminal accountability for grave violations. There is also an urgent need for the voice of civil society within Iran to be heard directly. The people of Iran urgently need protection, justice and international solidarity. We thank you.
Thank you very much. I now pass the floor to Baha'i International Community representative.
Mr. Vice President, Iranians deserve the right to play a decisive role in the future of their country. These weeks we have seen youth whose aspirations were long ignored by their government prepared to make many sacrifices for the upliftment of their nation, and their voices have carried across the world. Iran, once the birthplace of human rights, has for 4 decades seen its leaders stamp on its noble heritage. As we watched with shock and grief the loss of life in the country, we witness an undeniable truth, that repression can never destroy what's in a person's heart. It cannot crush one's innermost beliefs and desires and longing for a better life, for human dignity. The Baha'is in Iran have endured this persecution for 4 decades, responding to cruel injustice with nothing but resilience and service to their country. Today, they grieve not only for themselves, but for their fellow Iranians, as that repression is now inflicted on so many. Mr. President, the UN was founded on a simple promise that as one human family, we will ensure the well-being of all. Upholding justice in the face of repression is the one power that can translate humanity's ideals into reality. Today, this body has a responsibility to hold Iran's leaders accountable, to demand an end to these violations, and to urge them to uphold their sacred responsibility to protect their people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to have another video from the Organization for Defending Victims of Violence.
In recent weeks, protests in Iran began peacefully among some people and business owners, driven by economic hardship and currency instability from sanctions, but quickly escalated into organized violence and terrorist acts, with US and Israeli officials acknowledging intelligence involvement and destabilization efforts. Our society is under the threat of terrorism. The recent unrest, followed by more violent incidents, has caused deep trauma and distress among people. I have a few questions for this Council. Why do many Western states remain silent about foreign interference and the financial and logistical support provided to violent mercenaries? Why is there so little concern expressed about the killing of innocent civilians and children by organized terrorist groups? Why does the international community avert its gaze from the destruction of people's property and the creation of insecurity through external intervention? Is setting hospitals and public buildings on fire a form of peaceful protest? And when such acts are openly supported from abroad, does international law still call this peaceful? Why not allow societies to find their own? We urge the fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur on Iran to employ evidence-based language and avoid characterizing these events as peaceful when the documented conduct includes vandalism, arson, and terrorist acts. Thank you.
We'll now have the representative of Alliance Internationale pour la Défense des Droits et des Libertés.
Mr. President, on behalf of the International Alliance for Rights and Freedoms, IDLE, and the IDLE International Foundation for Dialogue and Peace, we express our strongest condemnation of the violent and systemic repression carried out by the authorities in the Islamic Republic of Iran against civilians. Credible UN reporting points to unlawful killings and the use of lethal force against peaceful protesters, mass arrests, incognito detention, enforced disappearances, torture and ill treatment, alongside an escalating risk of the death penalty being misused for political purposes. We further stress that the nationwide shutdown of internet and communications since the evening of 8 January 2026 is not an administrative measure but a tool of repression designated to conceal violations and obstruct documentation and evidence preservation as warned by the UN fact-finding mission and the UN experts who have called for this immediate end. The Human Rights Council does not need expression of concern today. It needs a deterrent decision grounded in international human rights law, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention Against Torture requiring the protection of the rights to the life. The absolute prohibition of torture, the ban on arbitrary detention, guarantees of fair trial rights, and the protection of freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. We thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Maloka International.
Gracias, Vicepresidente.
Thank you, Vice President. This special session reflects once more the increasing politicization of the Council. We're witnessing selective use of human rights as an instrument of geopolitical pressure. Iran is a state subject to the United Nations Charter, an instrument which embodies non-interference in internal affairs and the principle of sovereign equality of states. Selectively invoking violations without taking into account external threats is a distortion of this legal framework. In recent weeks, Iran has faced violent acts on its territory channeled by terrorist cells and interference by foreign intelligence services, seeking to create an escalation of external forces that cannot be ignored. Washington's actions, including explicit military threats, reflect a neo-colonial policy using human rights as justification for their strategic objectives in the region. The same methods of coercion struck Latin America and Greenland. They reflect a global pattern of geopolitical aggression which merits equal scrutiny on the part of this body. We recommend, therefore, Vice President, to this Council to protect peace, respect the right to self-determination and demand the lifting of unilateral coercive measures from the Iranian people and all peoples who suffer the consequences of structural violence of a system which governs us today. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Institute of Human Rights. Not in the room, I believe. Therefore, next up is International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims.
Mr. Vice President, the IRCT, together with the OMCT, Omega Research